A Country Doctor by Franz Kafka. Brought to you by Audio.ai. Translation by Ian Johnston. I was in great difficulty. An urgent journey was facing me. A seriously ill man was waiting for me in a village 10 miles distant. A severe snowstorm filled the space between him and me. I had a carriage, a light one, with large wheels, entirely suitable for our country roads. Wrapped up in furs with the bag of instruments in my hand, I was already standing in the courtyard ready for the journey, but the horse was missing. The horse. My own horse had died the previous night, as a result of overexertion in this icy winter. My servant girl was at that very moment running around the village to see if she could borrow a horse. But it was hopeless, I knew that, and I stood there useless, increasingly covered with snow, becoming all the time more immobile. The girl appeared at the gate, alone. She was swinging the lantern. Of course, who is now going to lend her his horse for such a journey? I walked once again across the courtyard. I couldn't see what to do. Distracted and tormented, I kicked my foot against the cracked door of the pigsty, which had not been used for years. The door opened and banged and FRO on its hinges. A warmth and smell as if from horses came out. A dim stall lantern on a rope swayed inside. A man huddled down in the stall below showed his open blue-eyed face. "Shall I hitch up?" he asked, crawling out on all fours. I didn't know what to say and bent down to see what was still in the stall. The servant girl stood beside me. "One doesn't know the sorts of things one has stored in one's own house," she said, and we both laughed. "Hey, brother, hey, sister," the groom cried out, and two horses, powerful animals with strong flanks, shoved their way one behind the other, legs close to the bodies, lowering their well-formed heads like camels, and getting through the door space, which they completely filled, only through the powerful movements of their rumps. But right away they stood up straight, long-legged, with thick, steaming bodies. "Help him," I said, and the girl obediently hurried to hand the wagon harness to the groom. But as soon as she was beside him, the groom puts his arms around her and pushes his face against hers. She screams out and runs over to me. On the girl's cheek were red marks from 2 rows of teeth. "You brute," I cry out in fury. "Do you want the whip?" But I immediately remember that he is a stranger, that I don't know where he comes from, and that he's helping me out of his own free will when everyone else is refusing to. As if he knows what I was thinking, he takes no offense at my threat, but turns around to me once more, still busy with the horses. Then he says, "Climb in," and in fact, everything is ready. I notice that I have never before traveled with such a beautiful team of horses, and I climb in happily. But I'll take the reins. "You don't know the way?" I say. "Of course," he says. "I'm not going with you. I'm staying with Rosa." "No," screams Rosa and runs into the house with an accurate premonition of the inevitability of her fate. I hear the door chain rattling as she sets it in place. I hear the lock click. I see how in addition she runs down the corridor and through the rooms, putting out all the lights in order to make herself impossible to find. "You're coming with me," I say to the groom, "or I'll give up the journey, no matter how urgent it is." "It's not my intention to give you the girl as the price of the trip." "Giddy up," he says and claps his hands. The carriage is torn away like a piece of wood in a current. I still hear how the door of my house is breaking down and splitting apart under the groom's onslaught. And then my eyes and ears are filled with a roaring sound which overwhelms all my senses at once. But only for a moment. Then I am already there, as if the farmyard of my invalid opens up immediately in front of my courtyard gate. The horses stand quietly. The snowfall has stopped, moonlight all around. The sick man's parents rush out of the house, his sister behind them. They almost lift me out of the carriage. I get nothing from their confused talking. In the sick room, one can hardly breathe the air. The neglected cooking stove is smoking. I want to push open the window, but first I'll look at the sick man. Thin, without fever, not cold, not warm, with empty eyes, without a shirt, the young man under the stuffed quilt heaves himself up, hangs around my throat, and whispers in my ear, "Doctor, let me die." I look around. No one has heard. The parents stand silently, leaning forward, and wait for my opinion. The sister has brought a stool for my handbag. I open the bag and look among my instruments. The young man constantly gropes at me from the bed to remind me of his request. I take some tweezers, test them in the candle light, and put them back. Yes, I think blasphemously, in such cases the gods do help. They send the missing horse, even add a second one because it's urgent, and even throw in a groom as a bonus. Now for the first time I think once more of Rosa. What am I doing? How am I saving her? How do I pull her out from under this groom, 10 miles away from her, with uncontrollable horses in the front of my carriage? These horses, who have somehow loosened their straps, are pushing open the window from outside, I don't know how. Each one is sticking its head through a window, and, unmoved by the crying of the family, is observing the invalid. I'll go back right away, I think, as if the horses were ordering me to journey back. But I allow the sister, who thinks I am in a daze because of the heat, to take off my fur coat. A glass of rum is prepared for me. The old man claps me on the shoulder. The sacrifice of his treasure justifies this familiarity. I shake my head. In the narrow circle of the old man's thinking I was not well, that's the only reason I refuse to drink. The mother stands by the bed and entices me over. I follow, and as a horse neighs loudly at the ceiling, lay my head on the young man's chest, which trembles under my wet beard. That confirms what I know. The young man is healthy. His circulation is a little off, saturated with coffee by his caring mother. But he's healthy, and best pushed out of bed with a shove. I'm no improver of the world, and let him lie there. I am employed by the district and do my duty to the full, right to the point where it's almost too much. Badly paid, but I'm generous and ready to help the poor. I still have to look after Rosa, and then the young man may have his way. And I want to die too. What am I doing here in this endless winter? My horse is dead, and there is no one in the village who'll lend me his. I have to drag my team out of the pigsty. If they hadn't happened to be horses, I'd have had to travel with pigs. That's the way it is. And I nod to the family. They know nothing about it. And if they did know, they wouldn't believe it. Incidentally, it's easy to write prescriptions, but difficult to come to an understanding with people. Now, at this point, my visit might have come to an end. They have once more called for my help unnecessarily. I'm used to that. With the help of my night bell, the entire region torments me. But that this time I had to sacrifice Rosa as well. This beautiful girl, who lives in my house all year long and whom I scarcely notice. This sacrifice is too great, and I must somehow in my own head subtly rationalize it away for the moment, in order not to let loose at this family who cannot, even with their best will, give me Rosa back again. But as I am closing up my handbag and calling for my fur coat, the family is standing together. The father sniffing the glass of rum in his hand, the mother, probably disappointed in me. What more do these people expect? Tearfully biting her lips, and the sister flapping a very bloody hand towel. I'm somehow ready in the circumstances to concede that the young man is perhaps nonetheless sick. I go to him. He smiles up at me, as if I was bringing him the most nourishing kind of soup. Ah, now both horses are whinnying. The noise is probably supposed to come from higher regions in order to illuminate my examination, and now I find out that, yes indeed, the young man is ill. On his right side, in the region of the hip, a wound the size of the palm of one's hand has opened up. Rose-colored, in many different shadings, dark in the depths, brighter on the edges, delicately grained, with uneven patches of blood, open to the light like a mine. That's what it looks like from a distance. Close up, a complication is apparent. Who can look at that without whistling softly? Worms as thick and long as my little finger, themselves rose-colored and also spattered with blood, are wriggling their white bodies with many limbs from their stronghold in the inner of the wound towards the light. Poor young man, there's no helping you. I have found out your great wound. You are dying from this flower on your side. The family is happy. They see me doing something. The sister says that to the mother tells the father tells a few guests who are coming in on tiptoe through the moonlight of the open door, balancing themselves with outstretched arms. "Will you save me?" whispers the young man, sobbing, quite blinded by the life inside his wound. That's how people are in my region, always demanding the impossible from the doctor. They have lost the old faith. The priest sits at home and tears his religious robes to pieces, one after the other. But the doctor is supposed to achieve everything with his delicate surgeon's hand. Well, it's what they like to think. I have not offered myself. If they use me for sacred purposes, I let that happen to me as well. What more do I want? An old country doctor, robbed of my servant girl. And they come, the families and the village elders, and take my clothes off. A choir of school children with the teacher at the head stands in front of the house and sings an extremely simple melody with the words, "Take his clothes off, then he'll heal, and if he doesn't cure, then kill him. It's only a doctor, it's only a doctor." Then I am stripped of my clothes, and, with my fingers in my beard and my head tilted to one side, I look at the people quietly. I am completely calm and clear about everything and stay that way too, although it is not helping me at all, for they are now taking me by the head and feet and dragging me into bed. They lay me against the wall on the side of wound. Then they all go out of the room. The door is shut. The singing stops. Clouds move in front of the moon. The bedclothes lie warmly around me. In the open space of the windows, the horses' heads sway like shadows. "Do you know," I hear someone saying in my ear, "my confidence in you is very small. You were shaken out from somewhere. You don't come on your own feet. Instead of helping, you give me less room on my deathbed. The best thing would be if I scratch your eyes out." "Right," I say. "It's a disgrace. But now I'm a doctor. What am I supposed to do? Believe me, things are not easy for me either. Should I be satisfied with this excuse? Alas, I'll probably have to be. I always have to make do. I came into the world with a beautiful wound. That was all I was furnished with. Young friend," I say, "your mistake is that you have no perspective. I've already been in all the sick rooms far and wide, and I tell you your wound is not so bad. Made in a tight corner with 2 blows from an axe. Many people offer their side and hardly hear the axe in the forest, to say nothing of the fact that it's coming closer to them. Is that really so, or are you deceiving me in my fever? It is truly so. Take the word of honor of a medical doctor." He took my word and grew still. But now it was time to think about my escape. The horses were still standing loyally in place. Clothes for coat and bag were quickly snatched up. I didn't want to delay by getting dressed if the horses rushed as they had on the journey out. I should, in fact, be springing out of that bed into my own, as it were. One horse obediently pulled back from the window. I threw the bundle into the carriage. The fur coat flew too far and was caught on a hook by only one arm. Good enough. I swung myself up onto the horse. The reins dragging loosely, one horse barely harnessed to the other, the carriage swaying behind. Last of all, the fur coat in the snow. "Giddy up," I said, but there was no giddying up about it. We dragged through the snowy desert like old men. For a long time, the fresh but inaccurate singing of the children resounded behind us. "Enjoy yourselves, you patients. The doctor's laid in bed with you. I'll never come home at this rate. My flourishing practice is lost. A successor is robbing me, but to no avail, for he cannot replace me. In my house, the disgusting groom is wreaking havoc. Rosa is his victim. I will not think it through. Naked, abandoned to the frost of this unhappy age, with an earthly carriage and unearthly horses, I drive around by myself, an old man. My fur coat hangs behind the wagon, but I cannot reach it, and no one from the nimble rabble of patients lifts a finger. Betrayed? Betrayed? Once one responds to a false alarm on the night bell, there's no making it good again, not ever. A Hunger Artist by Franz Kafka. Brought to you by Audio.ai. Translation by Ian Johnston. In the last decades, interest in hunger artists has declined considerably. Whereas in earlier days there was good money to be earned putting on major productions of this sort, under one's own management, nowadays that is totally impossible. Those were different times. Back then the hunger artist captured the attention of the entire city. From day to day while the fasting lasted, participation increased. Everyone wanted to see the hunger artist at least daily. During the final days there were people with subscription tickets who sat all day in front of the small barred cage. And there were even viewing hours at night, their impact heightened by torchlight. On fine days the cage was dragged out into the open air, and then the hunger artist was put on display particularly for the children. While for grown-ups the hunger artist was often merely a joke, something they participated in because it was fashionable, the children looked on amazed, their mouths open, holding each other's hands for safety, as he sat there on scattered straw, spurning a chair in a black tights, looking pale, with his ribs sticking out prominently, sometimes nodding politely, answering questions with a forced smile, even sticking his arm out through the bars to let people feel how emaciated he was, but then completely sinking back into himself, so that he paid no attention to anything, not even to what was so important to him, the striking of the clock, which was the single furnishing in the cage. Apart from the changing groups of spectators, there were also constant observers chosen by the public. Strangely enough, they were usually butchers, who, always 3 at a time, were given the task of observing the hunger artist day and night, so that he didn't get something to eat in some secret manner. It was, however, merely a formality, introduced to reassure the masses, for those who understood knew well enough that during the period of fasting the hunger artist would never, under any circumstances, have eaten the slightest thing, not even if compelled by force. The honor of his art forbade it. Naturally, none of the watchers understood that. Sometimes there were nightly groups of watchers who carried out their vigil very laxly, deliberately sitting together in a distant corner and putting all their attention into playing cards there, clearly intending to allow the hunger artist a small refreshment, which, according to their way of thinking, he could get from some secret supplies. Nothing was more excruciating to the hunger artist than such watchers. They depressed him. They made his fasting terribly difficult. Sometimes he overcame his weakness and sang during the time they were observing, for as long as he could keep it up, to show people how unjust their suspicions about him were. But that was little help. For then they just wondered among themselves about his skill at being able to eat even while singing. He much preferred the observers who sat down right against the bars, and, not satisfied with the dim backlighting of the room, illuminated him with electric flashlights. The glaring light didn't bother him in the slightest. Generally, he couldn't sleep at all, and he could always doze under any lighting and at any hour, even in an overcrowded, noisy auditorium. With such observers, he was very happily prepared to spend the entire night without sleeping. He was very pleased to joke with them, to recount stories from his nomadic life, and then, in turn, to listen their stories, doing everything just to keep them awake, so that he could keep showing them once again that he had nothing to eat in his cage, and that he was fasting as none of them could. He was happiest, however, when morning came and a lavish breakfast was brought for them at his own expense, on which they hurled themselves with the appetite of healthy men after a hard night's work without sleep. True, there were still people who wanted to see in this breakfast an unfair means of influencing the observers, but that was going too far, and if they were asked whether they wanted to undertake the observers' night shift for its own sake, without the breakfast, they excused themselves. But nonetheless they stood by their suspicions. However, it was in general part of fasting that these doubts were inextricably associated with it. For in fact, no one was in a position to spend time watching the hunger artist every day and night, so no one could know on the basis of his own observation whether this was a case of truly uninterrupted, flawless fasting. The hunger artist himself was the only one who could know that, and at the same time, the only spectator capable of being completely satisfied with his own fasting. But the reason he was never satisfied was something different. Perhaps it was not fasting at all which made him so very emaciated. that many people, to their own regret, had to stay away from his performance because they couldn't bear to look at him. For he was also so skeletal out of dissatisfaction with himself, because he alone knew something that even initiates didn't know: how easy it was to fast. It was the easiest thing in the world. About this he did not remain silent, but people did not believe him. At best they thought he was being modest. Most of them, however, believed he was a publicity seeker or a total swindler, for whom, at all events, fasting was easy, because he understood how to make it easy, and then had the nerve to half admit it. He had to accept all that. Over the years he had become accustomed to it. But this dissatisfaction kept gnawing at his insides all the time, and never yet, and this one had to say to his credit, had he left the cage of his own free will after any period of fasting. The impresario had set the maximum length of time for the fast at 40 days. He would never allow the fasting go on beyond that point, not even in the cosmopolitan cities. And in fact, he had a good reason. Experience had shown that for about 40 days, one could increasingly whip up a city's interest by gradually increasing advertising, but that then the people turned away. One could demonstrate a significant decline in popularity. In this respect, there were, of course, small differences among different towns and among different countries. But as a rule, it was true that 40 days was the maximum length of time. So then on the 40th day, the door of the cage, which was covered with flowers, was opened. An enthusiastic audience filled the amphitheater. A military band played. 2 doctors entered the cage in order to take the necessary measurements of the hunger artist. The results were announced to the auditorium through a megaphone. And finally 2 young ladies arrived, happy about the fact that they were the ones who had just been selected by lot, seeking to lead the hunger artist down a couple of steps out of the cage, where on a small table a carefully chosen hospital meal was laid out. And at this moment, the hunger artist always fought back. Of course, he still freely laid his bony arms in the helpful, outstretched hands of the ladies bending over him, but he did not want to stand up. Why stop right now after 40 days? He could have kept going for even longer, for an unlimited length of time. Why stop right now, when he was in his best form indeed, not yet even in his best fasting form? Why did people want to rob him of the fame of fasting longer, not just so that he could become the greatest hunger artist of all time, which he probably was already, but also so that he could surpass himself in some unimaginable way, for he felt there were no limits to his capacity for fasting? Why did this crowd, which pretended to admire him so much, have so little patience with him? If he kept going and kept fasting longer, why would they not tolerate it? Then, too, he was tired and felt good sitting in the straw. Now he was supposed to stand up straight and tall and go to eat, something which, when he just imagined it, made him feel nauseous right away. With great difficulty he repressed mentioning this only out of consideration for the women. And he looked up into the eyes of these women, apparently so friendly, but in reality so cruel, and shook his excessively heavy head on his feeble neck. But then happened what always happened. The impresario came, and in silence, the music made talking impossible, raised his arms over the hunger artist, as if inviting heaven to look upon its work here on the straw, this unfortunate martyr, something the hunger artist certainly was, only in a completely different sense, then grabbed the hunger artist around his thin waist, in the process wanting with his exaggerated caution to make people believe that here he had to deal with something fragile, and handed him over, not without secretly shaking him a little, so that the hunger artist's legs and upper body swung back and forth uncontrollably, to the women, who had in the meantime turned as pale as death. At this point, the hunger artist endured everything. His head lay on his chest. It was as if it had inexplicably rolled around and just stopped there. His body was arched back. His legs, in an impulse of self-preservation, pressed themselves together at the knees, but scraped the ground, as if they were not really on the floor, but were looking for the real ground. And the entire weight of his body, admittedly very small, lay against one of the women, who appealed for help with flustered breath, for she had not imagined her post of honor would be like this, and then stretched her neck as far as possible, to keep her face from the least contact with the hunger artist. But then, when she couldn't manage this, and her more fortunate companion didn't come to her assistance, then came the meal. The impresario put a little food into mouth of the hunger artist, now half unconscious, as if fainting, and kept up a cheerful patter designed to divert attention away from the hunger artist's condition. Then a toast was proposed to the public, which was supposedly whispered to the impresario by the hunger artist. The orchestra confirmed everything with a great fanfare. People dispersed, and no one had the right to be dissatisfied with the event. No one except the hunger artist. He was always the only one. He lived this way, taking small regular breaks for many years, apparently in the spotlight, honored by the world, but for all that his mood was usually gloomy, and it kept growing gloomier all the time, because no one understood how to take him seriously. But how was he to find consolation? What was there left for him to wish for? And if a good-natured man who felt sorry for him ever wanted to explain to him that his sadness probably came from his fasting, then it could happen that the hunger artist responded with an outburst of rage and began to shake the bars like an animal, frightening everyone. But the impresario had a way of punishing moments like this, something he was happy to use. He would make an apology for the hunger artist to the assembled public, conceding that the irritability had been provoked only by his fasting, something quite intelligible to well-fed people, and capable of excusing the behavior of the hunger artist without further explanation. From there he would move on to speak about the equally hard-to-understand claim of the hunger artist, that he could go on fasting for much longer than he was doing. He would praise the lofty striving, the goodwill, and the great self-denial no doubt contained in this claim, but then would try to contradict it simply by producing photographs, which were also on sale, for in the pictures one could see the hunger artist on the 40th day of his fast, in bed, almost dead from exhaustion. Although the hunger artist was very familiar with this perversion of the truth, it always strained his nerves again and was too much for him. What was a result of the premature ending of the fast people were now proposing as its cause. It was impossible to fight against this lack of understanding, against this world of misunderstanding. In good faith, he always listened eagerly to the impresario at the bars of his cage. But each time, once the photographs came out, he would let go of the bars and, with a sigh, sink back into the straw, and a reassured public could come up again and view him. When those who had witnessed such scenes thought back on them a few years later, often they were unable to understand themselves. For in the meantime that change mentioned above had set it. It happened almost immediately. There may have been more profound reasons for it, but who bothered to discover what they were? At any rate, one day the pampered hunger artist saw himself abandoned by the crowd of pleasure seekers who preferred to stream to other attractions. The impresario chased around half of Europe one more time with him to see whether he could still rediscover the old interest here and there. It was all futile. It was as if a secret agreement against the fasting performances had developed everywhere. Naturally, it couldn't really have happened all at once, and people later remembered some things which in the days of intoxicating success they hadn't paid sufficient attention to. Some inadequately suppressed indications, but now it was too late to do anything to counter them. Of course, it was certain that the popularity of fasting would return once more someday. But for those now alive, that was no consolation. What was the hunger artist to do now? A man whom thousands of people had cheered on could not display himself in show booths at small fun fairs. The hunger artist was not only too old to take up a different profession, but was fanatically devoted to fasting more than anything else. So he said farewell to the impresario, an incomparable companion on his life's road, and let himself be hired by a large circus. In order to spare his own feelings, he didn't even look at the terms of his contract at all. A large circus with its huge number of men, animals, and gimmicks, which are constantly being let go and replenished, can use anyone at any time, even a hunger artist, provided, of course, his demands are modest. Moreover, in this particular case, it was not only the hunger artist himself who was engaged, but also his old and famous name. In fact, given the characteristic nature of his art, which was not diminished by his advancing age, one could never claim that a worn-out artist, who no longer stood at the pinnacle of his ability, wanted to escape to a quiet position in the circus. On the contrary, the hunger artist declared that he could fast just as well as in earlier times, something that was entirely credible. Indeed, he even affirmed that if people would let him do what he wanted, and he was promised this without further ado, he would really now legitimately amaze the world for the first time, an assertion which, however, given the mood of the time, which the hunger artist in his enthusiasm easily overlooked, only brought smiles from the experts. However, basically the hunger artist had not forgotten his sense of the way things really were, and he took it as self-evident that people would not set him and his cage up as the star attraction somewhere in the middle of the arena, but would move him outside in some other readily accessible spot near the animal stalls. Huge brightly painted signs surrounded the cage and announced what there was to look at there. During the intervals in the main performance, when the general public pushed out towards the menagerie in order to see the animals, they could hardly avoid moving past the hunger artist and stopping there a moment. They would perhaps have remained with him longer if those pushing up behind them in the narrow passageway, who did not understand this pause on the way to the animal stalls they wanted to see, had not made a longer peaceful observation impossible. This was also the reason why the hunger artist began to tremble at these visiting hours, which he naturally used to long for as the main purpose of his life. In the early days, he could hardly wait for the pauses in the performances. He had looked forward with delight to the crowd pouring around him, until he became convinced only too quickly, and even the most stubborn, almost deliberate self-deception could not hold out against the experience that, judging by their intentions, most of these people were, again and again without exception, only visiting the menagerie. And this view from a distance still remained his most beautiful moment. For when they had come right up to him, he immediately got an earful from the shouting of the two steadily increasing groups, the ones who wanted to take their time looking at the hunger artist, not with any understanding, but on a whim or from mere defiance. For him, these ones were soon the more painful, and a second group of people whose only demand was to go straight to the animal stalls. Once the large crowds had passed, the latecomers would arrive, and although there was nothing preventing these people any more from sticking around for as long as they wanted, they rushed past with long strides, almost without a sideways glance, to get to the animals in time. And it was an all too rare stroke of luck when the father of a family came by with his children, pointed his finger at the hunger artist, gave a detailed explanation about what was going on here, and talked of earlier years when he had been present at similar but incomparably more magnificent performances, and then the children, because they had been inadequately prepared at school and in life, always stood around still uncomprehendingly. What was fasting to them? But nonetheless, the brightness of the look in their searching eyes revealed something of new and more gracious times coming. Perhaps, the hunger artist said to himself sometimes, everything would be a little better if his location were not quite so near the animal stalls. That way it would be easy for people to make their choice, to say nothing of the fact that he was very upset and constantly depressed by the stink from the stalls, the animals' commotion at night, the pieces of raw meat dragged past him for the carnivorous beasts, and the roars at feeding time. But he did not dare to approach the administration about it. In any case, he had the animals to thank for the crowds of visitors among whom here and there could be one destined for him, and who knew where they would hide him if he wished to remind them of his existence, and along with that, of the fact that, strictly speaking, he was only an obstacle on the way to the menagerie. A small obstacle at any rate, a constantly diminishing obstacle. People got used to the strange notion that in these times they would want to pay attention to a hunger artist, and with this habitual awareness, the judgment on him was pronounced. He might fast as well as he could, and he did, but nothing could save him anymore. People went straight past him. Try to explain the art of fasting to anyone. If someone doesn't feel it, then he cannot be made to understand it. The beautiful signs became dirty and illegible. People tore them down, and no one thought of replacing them. The small table with the number of days the fasting had lasted, which early on had been carefully renewed every day, remained unchanged for a long time, for after the first weeks, the staff grew tired of even this small task. And so the hunger artist kept fasting on, as he once had dreamed about in earlier times, and he had no difficulty succeeding in achieving what he had predicted back then. But no one was counting the days. No one, not even the hunger artist himself, knew how great his achievement was by this point, and his heart grew heavy. And when once in a while a person strolling past stood there making fun of the old number and talking of a swindle, that was in a sense the stupidest lie which indifference and innate maliciousness could invent, for the hunger artist was not being deceptive. He was working honestly, but the world was cheating him of his reward. Many days went by once more, and this too came to an end. Finally, the cage caught the attention of a supervisor, and he asked the attendant why they had left this perfectly useful cage standing here unused with rotting straw inside. Nobody knew until one man, with the help of the table with a number on it, remembered the hunger artist. They pushed the straw around with a pole and found the hunger artist in there. "Are you still fasting?" the supervisor asked. "When are you finally going to stop?" "Forgive me everything," whispered the hunger artist. Only the supervisor, who was pressing his ear up against the cage, understood him. "Certainly," said the supervisor, tapping his forehead with his finger in order to indicate to the spectators the state the hunger artist was in. "We forgive you." "I always wanted you to admire my fasting," said the hunger artist. "But we do admire it," said the supervisor obligingly. "But you shouldn't admire it," said the hunger artist. "Well then, we don't admire it," said the supervisor. "But why shouldn't we admire it?" "Because I had to fast. I can't do anything else," said the hunger artist. "Just look at you," said the supervisor. "Why can't you do anything else?" "Because," said the hunger artist, lifting his head a little and, with his lips pursed as if for a kiss, speaking right into the supervisor's ear so that he wouldn't miss anything, "because I couldn't find a food which I enjoyed. If I had found that, believe me, I would not have made a spectacle of myself and would have eaten to my heart's content, like you and everyone else." Those were his last words, but in his failing eyes there was the firm, if no longer proud, conviction that he was continuing to fast. "All right, tidy this up now," said the supervisor. And they buried the hunger artist along with the straw. But in his cage they put a young panther. Even for a person with the dullest mind, it was clearly refreshing to see this wild animal throwing itself around in this cage, which had been dreary for such a long time. It lacked nothing. Without thinking about it for any length of time, the guards brought the animal food. It enjoyed the taste and never seemed to miss its freedom. This noble body, equipped with everything necessary, almost to the point of bursting, also appeared to carry freedom around with it. That seemed to be located somewhere or other in its teeth, and its joy in living came with such strong passion from its throat that it was not easy for spectators to keep watching. But they controlled themselves, kept pressing around the cage, and had no desire to move on. A Report for an Academy by Franz Kafka. Brought to you by Audio.ai. Translation by Ian Johnston. Esteemed gentlemen of the Academy, you show me the honor of calling upon me to submit a report to the Academy concerning my previous life as an ape. In this sense, unfortunately, I cannot comply with your request. Almost 5 years separate me from my existence as an ape, a short time perhaps when measured by the calendar, but endlessly long to gallop through as I have done, at times accompanied by splendid men, advice, applause, and orchestral music, but basically alone, since all those accompanying me held themselves back a long way from the barrier, in order to preserve the image. This achievement would have been impossible if I had stubbornly wished to hold on to my origin, onto the memories of my youth. Giving up that obstinacy was, in fact, the highest command that I gave myself. I, a free ape, submitted myself to this yoke. In so doing, however, my memories for their part constantly closed themselves off against me. If people had wanted it, my journey back at first would have been possible through the entire gateway which heaven builds over the earth, but as my development was whipped onwards, the gate simultaneously grew lower and narrower all the time. I felt myself more comfortable and more enclosed in the world of human beings. The storm which blew me out of my past eased off. Today it is only a gentle breeze which cools my heels. And the distant hole through which it comes and through which I once came has become so small that, even if I had sufficient power and will to run back there, I would have to scrape the fur off my body in order to get through. Speaking frankly, as much as I like choosing metaphors for these things, speaking frankly, your experience as apes, gentlemen, to the extent that you have something of that sort behind you, cannot be more distant from you than mine is from me. But it tickles at the heels of everyone who walks here on earth, the small chimpanzee, as well as the great Achilles. In the narrowest sense, however, I can perhaps answer your question nonetheless, and indeed I do so with great pleasure. The first thing I learned was to give a handshake. The handshake displays candor. Today, when I stand at the high point of my career, may I to that first handshake also my candid words. For the Academy it will not provide anything essentially new, and will fall far short of what people have asked of me, and what with the best will I cannot speak about, but nonetheless it should demonstrate the line by which someone who was an ape was forced into the world of men, and which he has continued there. Yet I would certainly not permit myself to say even the trivial things which follow, if I were not completely sure of myself, and if my position on all the great music hall stages of the civilized world had not established itself unassailably. I come from the Gold Coast. For an account of how I was captured, I rely on the reports of strangers. A hunting expedition from the firm of Hagenbach, incidentally. Since then, I have already emptied a number of bottles of good red wine with the leader of that expedition. Lay hidden in the bushes by the shore when I ran down in the evening in the middle of a band of apes for a drink. Someone fired a shot. I was the only one struck. I received 2 hits. One was in the cheek, that was superficial. But it left behind a large hairless red scar, which earned me the name Red Peter, a revolting name, completely inappropriate, presumably something invented by an ape, as if the only difference between me and the recently deceased trained ape Peter, who was well known here and there, was the red patch on my cheek. But this is only by the way. The second shot hit me below the hip. It was serious. It's the reason that today I still limp a little. Recently I read in an article by one of the 10,000 gossipers who vent their opinions about me in the newspapers that my ape nature is not yet entirely repressed. The proof is that when visitors come I take pleasure in pulling off my trousers to show the entry wound caused by this shot. That fellow should have each finger of his writing hand shot off one by one. So far as I am concerned, I may pull my trousers down in front of anyone I like. People will not find there anything other than well cared for fur and the scar from. Let us select here a precise word for a precise purpose, something that will not be misunderstood. The scar from a wicked shot. Everything is perfectly open. There is nothing to hide. When it comes to a question of the truth, every great mind discards the most subtle refinements of manners. However, if that writer were to pull down his trousers when he gets a visitor, that would certainly produce a different sight, and I'll take it as a sign of reason that he does not do that. But then he should not bother me with his delicate sensibilities. After those shots I woke up, and here my own memory gradually begins, in a cage between decks on the Hagenbeck steamship. It was no four-sided cage with bars, but only 3 walls fixed to a crate, so that the crate constituted the 4th wall. The whole thing was too low to stand upright and too narrow for sitting down. So I crouched with bent knees, which shook all the time, and since at first I probably did not wish to see anyone and to remain constantly in the darkness, I turned towards the crate while the bars of the cage cut into the flesh on my back. People consider such confinement of wild animals beneficial in the very first period of time, and today I cannot deny, on the basis of my own experience, that in a human sense that is, in fact, the case. But at that time, I didn't think about it. For the first time in my life I was without a way out. At least there was no direct way out. Right in front of me was the crate, its boards fitted closely together. Well, there was a hole running right through the boards. When I first discovered it, I welcomed it with a blissfully happy howl of ignorance. But this hole was not nearly big enough to stick my tail through, and all the power of an ape could not make it any bigger. According to what I was told later, I'm supposed to have made remarkably little noise. From that, people concluded that either I must soon die, or, if I succeeded in surviving the first critical period, I would be very capable of being trained. I survived this period. Muffled sobbing, painfully searching out fleas, wearily licking a coconut, banging my skull against the wall of the crate, sticking out my tongue when anyone came near. These were the first occupations in my new life. In all of them, however, there was only one feeling: no way out. Nowadays, of course, I can portray those ape-like feelings only with human words, and as a result, I misrepresent them. But even if I can no longer attain the old truth of the ape, at least it lies in the direction I have described. Of that there is no doubt. Up until then I had had so many ways out, and now I no longer had one. I was tied down. If they had nailed me down, my freedom to move would not have been any less. And why? If you scratch raw the flesh between your toes, you won't find the reason. If you press your back against the bars of the cage until it almost slices you in two, you won't find the answer. I had no way out, but I had to come up with one for myself. For without that, I could not live. Always in front of that crate wall, I would inevitably have died a miserable death. But according to Hagenbeck, apes belong at the crate wall. Well, that meant I had to cease being an ape. A clear and beautiful train of thought, which I must have planned somehow with my belly, since apes think with their bellies. I'm worried that people do not understand precisely what I mean by a way out. I use the word in its most common and fullest sense. I am deliberately not saying freedom. I do not mean this great feeling of freedom on all sides. As an ape, I perhaps recognized it, and I have met human beings who yearn for it. But as far as I am concerned, I did not demand freedom either then or today. Incidentally, among human beings, people all too often are deceived by freedom. And since freedom is reckoned among the most sublime feelings, the corresponding disappointment is also among the most sublime. In the variety shows before my entrance, I have often watched a pair of artists busy on trapezes high up in the roof. They swung themselves, they rocked back and forth, they jumped, they hung in each other's arms. One held the other by clenching the hair with his teeth. That, too, is human freedom, I thought. Self-controlled movement, what a mockery of sacred nature. At such a sight, no structure would stand up to the laughter of the apes. No, I didn't want freedom. Only a way out, to the right or left or anywhere at all. I made no other demands, even if the way out should be only an illusion. The demand was small, the disappointment would not be any greater, to move on further, to move on further. Only not to stand still with arms raised, pressed again a crate wall. Today I see clearly that without the greatest inner calm, I would never have been able to get out. And in fact, I probably owe everything that I have become to the calmness which came over me after the first days there on the ship. And in turn, I owe that calmness to the people on the ship. They are good people, in spite of everything. Today I still enjoy remembering the clang of their heavy steps, which used to echo then in my half-sleep. They had the habit of tackling everything extremely slowly. If one of them wanted to rub his eyes, he raised his hand as if it were a hanging weight. Their jokes were gross but hearty. Their laughter was always mixed with a rasp which sounded dangerous but meant nothing. They always had something in their mouths to spit out, and they didn't care where they spat. They always complained that my fleas sprung over onto them, but they were never seriously angry at me because of it. They even knew that fleas like being in my fur, and that fleas are jumpers. They learned to live with that. When they had no duties, sometimes a few of them sat down in a semicircle around me. They didn't speak much, but only made noises to each other and smoked their pipes, stretched out on the crates. They slapped their knees as soon as I made the slightest movement, and from time to time, one of them would pick up a stick and tickle me where I liked it. If I were invited today to make a journey on that ship, I'd certainly decline the invitation, but it's equally certain that the memories I could dwell on of the time there between the decks would not be totally hateful. The calmness which I acquired in this circle of people prevented me, above all, from any attempt to escape. Looking at it nowadays, it seems to me as if I had at least sensed that I had to find a way out if I wanted to live, but that this way out could not be reached by escaping. I no longer know if escape was possible, but I think it was. For an ape, it should always be possible to flee. With my present teeth, I have to be careful even with the ordinary task of cracking a nut. But then I must have been able over time to succeed in chewing through the lock on the door. I didn't do that. What would I have achieved by doing that? No sooner would I have stuck my head out than they would have captured me again and locked me up in an even worse cage. Or I could have taken refuge unnoticed among the other animals, say, the boa constrictors opposite me, and breathed my last in their embraces. Or I could have managed to steal way up to the deck and jumped overboard. Then I'd have tossed back and forth for a while on the ocean and drowned. Acts of despair. I did not think things through in such a human way, but under the influence of my surroundings, conducted myself as if I had worked things out. I did not work things out, but I observed well in complete tranquility. I saw these men going back and forth, always the same faces, the same movements. Often it seemed to me as if there was only one man. So the man or these men went undisturbed. A lofty purpose dawned on me. No one promised me that if I could become like them, the cage would be removed. Such promises, apparently impossible to fulfill, were not made. But if one makes the fulfillment good, then later the promises appear precisely there, where one had looked for them earlier without success. Now these men in themselves were nothing which attracted me very much. If I had been a follower of that freedom I just mentioned, I would certainly have preferred the ocean to the way out displayed in the dull gaze of these men. But in any case, I observed them for a long time before I even thought about such things. In fact, the accumulated observations first pushed me in the proper direction. It was so easy to imitate these people. I could already spit on the first day. We used to spit in each other's faces. The only difference was that I licked my face clean afterwards. They did not. Soon I was smoking a pipe like an old man, and if I then pressed my thumb down into the bowl of the pipe, the entire area between decks cheered. Still, for a long time, I did not understand the difference between an empty and a full pipe. I had the greatest difficulty with the bottle of alcohol. The smell was torture to me. I forced myself with all my power, but weeks went by before I could overcome my reaction. Curiously enough, the people took this inner struggle more seriously than anything else about me. In my memories, I don't distinguish the people, but there was one who always came back, alone or with comrades, day and night at different times. He'd stand with a bottle in front of me and give me instructions. He did not understand me. He wanted to solve the riddle of my being. He used to uncork the bottle slowly and then look at me in order to test if I had understood. I confess that I always looked at him with wildly over-eager attentiveness. No human teacher has ever found in the entire world such a student of human beings. After he'd uncorked the bottle, he'd raise it to his mouth. I'd gaze at him, right at his throat. He would nod, pleased with me, and set the bottle to his lips. Delighted with my gradual understanding, I'd squeal and scratch myself all over, wherever it was convenient. He was happy. He'd set the bottle to his mouth and take a swallow. Impatient and desperate to emulate him, I would defecate over myself in my cage, and that again gave him great satisfaction. Then, holding the bottle at arm's length and bringing it up again with a swing, he'd drink it down with one gulp, exaggerating his backward bending as a way of instructing me. Exhausted with so much great effort, I could no longer follow and hung weakly onto the bars, while he ended the theoretical lesson by rubbing his belly and grinning. Now the practical exercises first began. Was I not already too tired out by the theoretical part? Yes, indeed, far too weary. That's part of my fate. Nonetheless, I'd grab the proffered bottle as well as I could and uncork it trembling. Once I'd managed to do that, new forces gradually take over. I lift the bottle, with hardly any difference between me and the original, put it to my lips, and throw it away in disgust. In disgust, although it is empty and filled only with the smell, throw it with disgust onto the floor. To the sorrow of my teacher, to my own greater sorrow. And I still do not console him or myself when, after throwing away the bottle, I do not forget to give my belly a splendid rub and to grin as I do so. All too often, the lesson went that way. And to my teacher's credit, he was not angry with me. Well, sometimes he held his burning pipe against my fur in some place or other, which I could reach only with difficulty, until it began to burn. But then he would put it out himself with his huge good hand. He wasn't angry with me. He realized that we were fighting on the same side against ape nature, and that I had the more difficult part. What a victory it was for him and for me, however, when one evening in front of a large circle of onlookers, perhaps it was a celebration, a gramophone was playing, and Officer was wandering around among the people, when on this evening, at a moment when no one was watching, I grabbed a bottle of alcohol, which had been inadvertently left standing in front of my cage, uncorked it just as I had been taught, amid the rising attention of the group, set it against my mouth, and without hesitating, with my mouth making no grimace, like an expert drinker, with my eyes rolling around, splashing the liquid in my throat, I really and truly drank the bottle empty, and then threw it away, no longer in. Well, I did forget to scratch my belly. But instead of that, because I couldn't do anything else, because I had to, because my senses were roaring, I cried out a short and good hello, breaking out into human sounds. And with this cry I sprang into the community of human beings, and I felt its echo. Just listen. He's talking, like a kiss on my entire sweat-soaked body. I'll say it again. Imitating human beings was not something which pleased me. I imitated them because I was looking for a way out, for no other reason. And even in that victory, little was achieved. My voice immediately failed me again. It first came back months later. My distaste for the bottle of alcohol became even stronger. But at least my direction was given to me once and for all. When I was handed over in Hamburg to my first trainer, I soon realized the two possibilities open to me, the zoological garden or the music hall. I did not hesitate. I said to myself, use all your energy to get into the music hall. That is the way out. The zoological garden is only a new barred cage. If you go there, you're lost. And I learned, gentlemen. Alas, one learns when one has to. One learns when one wants a way out. One learns ruthlessly. One supervises oneself with a whip and tears oneself apart at the slightest resistance. My ape nature ran off, head over heels, out of me, so that in the process, my first teacher himself almost became an ape and soon had to give up training and be carried off to a mental hospital. Fortunately, he was soon discharged again. But I went through many teachers, indeed, even several teachers at once. As I became more confident of my abilities and the general public followed my progress, and my future began to brighten, I took on teachers myself, let them sit down in 5 interconnected rooms, and studied with them all simultaneously, by constantly leaping from one room into another. And such progress! The penetrating effects of the rays of knowledge from all sides on my awaking brain. I don't deny the fact, I was delighted with it. But I also confess that I did not overestimate it. Not even then, even less today. With an effort which up to this point has never been repeated on Earth, I have attained the average education of a European. That would perhaps not amount to much, but it is something insofar as it helped me out of the cage and created this special way out for me, the way out of human beings. There is an excellent German expression, to beat one's way through the bushes. That I have done. I have beaten my way through the bushes. I had no other way, always assuming that freedom was not a choice. If I review my development and its goal up to this point, I do not complain. I am even satisfied. With my hands in my trouser pockets, the bottle of wine on the table, I half lie and half sit in my rocking chair and gaze out the window. If I have a visitor, I welcome him as is appropriate. My impresario sits in the parlor. If I ring, he comes and listens to what I have to say. In the evening, I almost always have a performance, and my success could hardly rise any higher. When I come home late from banquets, from scientific societies, or from social gatherings in someone's home, a small half-trained female chimpanzee is waiting for me, and I take my pleasure with her the way apes do. During the day, I don't want to see her. for she has in her gaze the madness of a bewildered trained animal. I'm the only one who recognizes that, and I cannot bear it. On the whole, at any rate, I have achieved what I wish to achieve. You shouldn't say it wasn't worth the effort. In any case, I don't want any man's judgment. I only want to expand knowledge. I simply report, even to you, esteemed gentlemen of the Academy, I have only made a report. An Imperial Message by Franz Kafka. Brought to you by Audio.ai. For Kafka Archives. Translation by Ian Johnston. The Emperor, so they say, has sent a message directly from his deathbed to you alone, his pathetic subject, a tiny shadow which has taken refuge at the furthest distance from the imperial sun. He ordered the herald to kneel down beside his bed and whispered the message in his ear. He thought it was so important that he had the herald speak it back to him. He confirmed the accuracy of verbal message by nodding his head. And in front of the entire crowd of those witnessing his death, all the obstructing walls have been broken down, and all the great ones of his empire are standing in a circle on the broad and high-soaring flights of stairs. In front of all of them, he dispatched his herald. The messenger started off at once, a powerful, tireless man. Sticking one arm out, and then another, he makes his way through the crowd. If he runs into resistance, he points to his breast where there is a sign of the sun. So he moves forwards easily, unlike anyone else. But the crowd is so huge, its dwelling places are infinite. If there were an open field, how he would fly along, and soon you would hear the marvelous pounding of his fist on your door. But instead of that, how futile are all his efforts. He is still forcing his way through the private rooms of the innermost palace. Never will he win his way through. And if he did manage that, nothing would have been achieved. He would have to fight his way down the steps, and if he managed to do that, nothing would have been achieved. He would have to stride through the courtyards, and after the courtyards through the second palace, encircling the first, and then again through stairs and courtyards, and then once again a palace, and so on for thousands of years. And if he finally bursts through the outermost door, but that can never happen, the royal capital city, the center of the world, is still there in front of him, piled high and full of sediment. No one pushes his way through here, certainly not someone with a message from a dead man. But you sit at your window and dream of that message when evening comes. Jackals and Arabs by Franz Kafka. Brought to you by Audio.ai. We were camping in the oasis. My companions were asleep. An Arab, tall and dressed in white, went past me. He had been tending to his camels and was going to his sleeping place. I threw myself on my back into the grass. I wanted to sleep. I couldn't. The howling of a jackal in the distance, I asked a tee up straight again. And what had been so far away was suddenly close by. A swarming pack of jackals around me, their eyes flashing dull gold and going out, slender bodies moving in a quick, coordinated manner, as if responding to a whip. One of them came from behind, pushed himself under my arm, right against me, as if it needed my warmth, then stepped in front of me and spoke, almost eye to eye with me. I'm the oldest jackal for miles around. I'm happy I'm still able to welcome you here. I had already almost given up hope, for we've been waiting for you an infinitely long time. My mother waited, and her mother, and all her mothers, right back to the mother of all jackals. Believe me. That surprises me, I said, forgetting to light the pile of wood which lay ready to keep the jackals away with its smoke. I'm very surprised to hear that. I've come from the high north merely by chance, and am in the middle of a short trip. What do you jackals want then? As if encouraged by this conversation, which was perhaps too friendly, they drew their circle more closely around me, all panting and snarling. We know, the oldest began, that you come from the north. Our hope rests on that very point. In the north there is a way of understanding things which one cannot find here among the Arabs. You know, from their cool arrogance, one cannot strike a spark of common sense. They kill animals to eat them, and they disregard rotting carcasses. Don't speak so loud, I said. There are Arabs sleeping close by. You really are a stranger, said the jackal. Otherwise you would know that throughout the history of the world, a jackal has never yet feared an Arab. Should we fear them? Is it not misfortune enough that we have been cast out among such people? Maybe that could be, I said. I'm not up to judging things which are so far removed from me. It seems to be a very old conflict. It's probably in the blood, and so perhaps will only end with blood. You are very clever, said the old jackal, and they all panted even more quickly, their lungs breathing rapidly, although they were standing still. A bitter smell streamed out of their open jaws. At times I could tolerate it only by clenching my teeth. You are very clever. What you said corresponds to our ancient doctrine. So we take their blood, and the quarrel is over. Oh, I said, more sharply than I intended. They'll defend themselves. They'll shoot you down in droves with their guns. You do not understand us, he said. A characteristic of human beings which has not disappeared, not even in the high north. We are not going to kill them. The Nile would not have enough water to wash us clean. The very sight of their living bodies makes us run away immediately into cleaner air, into the desert, which, for that very reason, is our home. All the jackals surrounding us, and in the meantime, many more had come up from a distance, lowered their heads between the front legs, and cleaned them with their paws. It was as if they wanted to conceal an aversion which was so terrible that I would have much preferred to take a big jump and escape beyond their circle. So what do you intend to do? I asked. I wanted to stand up, but I couldn't. Two young animals were holding me firmly from behind with their jaws biting my jacket and shirt. I had to remain sitting. They are holding your train, said the old jackal seriously, by way of explanation, a mark of respect. They should let me go, I cried out, turning back and forth between the old one and the young ones. Of course they will, said the old one, if that's what you want. But it will take a little while, for, as is our habit, they have dug their teeth in deep and must first let their jaws open gradually. Meanwhile, listen to our request. Your conduct has not made me particularly receptive to it, I said. Don't make us pay for our clumsiness, he said. And now, for the first time, he brought the plaintive tone of his natural voice to his assistance. We are poor animals. All we have is our teeth. For everything we want to do, good and bad, the only thing available to us is our teeth. So what do you want? I asked, only slightly reassured. Sir, he cried out, and all the jackals howled. To me it sounded very remotely like a melody. Sir, you should end the quarrel which divides the world in two. Our ancestors described a man like you as the one who will do it. We must be free of the Arabs, with air we can breathe, a view of the horizon around us clear of Arabs. No cries of pain from a sheep which an Arab has knifed, and every animal should die peacefully and be left undisturbed for us to drain it empty and clean it right down to the bones. Cleanliness, that's what we want, nothing but cleanliness. Now they were all crying and sobbing. How can you bear it in this world, you noble heart and sweet entrails? Dirt is their white. Dirt is their black. Their beards are horrible. Looking at the corner of their eyes makes one spit. And if they lift their arms, hell opens up in their armpits. And that's why, sir, that's why, my dear sir, with the help of your all-capable hands, you must use these scissors to slit right through their throats. He jerked his head, and in response, a jackal came up carrying on its canine tooth a small pair of sewing scissors covered with old rust. So finally the scissors, it's time to stop, cried the Arab leader of our caravan, who had crept up on us from downwind. Now he swung his gigantic whip. The jackals all fled quickly, but still remained at some distance, huddled closely together. Many animals so close and stiff that it looked as if they were in a narrow pen with jack-o'-lanterns flying around them. So you too, sir, have seen and heard this spectacle, said the Arab, laughing as cheerfully as the reticence of his race permitted. So you know what the animals want? I asked. Of course, sir, he said. That's common knowledge. As long as there are Arabs, These scissors will wander with us through the deserts until the end of days. Every European is offered them for the great work. Every European is exactly the one they think qualified to do it. These animals have an absurd hope. They're idiots, real idiots. That's why we're fond of them. They are our dogs, finer than the ones you have. Now, watch this. In the night a camel died. I have had it brought here. 4 bearers came and threw the heavy carcass right in front of us. No sooner was it lying there than the jackals raised their voices. Every one of them crept forward, its body scraping the ground as if drawn by an irresistible rope. They had forgotten the Arabs, forgotten their hatred. The presence of a powerfully stinking dead body wiped out everything and enchanted them. One of them was already hanging at the camel's throat, and with its first bite had found the artery. Like a small angry pump which, with a determination matched only by its hopelessness, seeks to put out an overpowering fire, every muscle of its body pulled and twitched in its place. Then right away all them were lying there on the corpse working in the same way, piled up like a mountain. Then the leader cracked his sharp whip powerfully all around above them. They raised their heads, half fainting in their intoxicated state, looked at the Arab standing in front of them, started to feel the whip now hitting their muzzles, jumped away, and ran back a distance. But the camel's blood was already lying there in pools, stinking to heaven, and the body was torn wide open in several places. They could not resist. They were there again. The leader once more raised his whip. I grabbed his arm. "Sir, you are right," he said. "We'll leave them to their calling. Besides, it's time to break camp. You've seen them. Wonderful creatures, aren't they? And how they hate us." The end. The Judgment by Franz Kafka. Brought to you by Audio.ai. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. It was a Sunday morning in the very height of spring. Georg Bendeman, a young merchant, was sitting in his own room on the first floor of one of a long row of small, ramshackle houses stretching beside the river, which were scarcely distinguishable from each other in height and coloring. He had just finished a letter to an old friend of his who was now living abroad, had put it into its envelope in a slow and dreamy fashion, and with his elbows propped on the writing table was gazing out of the window at the river, the bridge, and the hills on the farther bank with their tender green. He was thinking about his friend, who had actually run away to Russia some years before, being dissatisfied with his prospects at home. Now he was carrying on a business in St. Petersburg, which had flourished to begin with, but had long been going downhill, as he always complained on his increasingly rare visits. So he was wearing himself out to no purpose in a foreign country. The unfamiliar full beard he wore did not quite conceal the face Georg had known so well since childhood, and his skin was growing so yellow as to indicate some latent disease. By his own account, he had no regular connection with the colony of his fellow countrymen out there, and almost no social intercourse with Russian families, so that he was resigning himself to becoming a permanent bachelor. What could one write to such a man, who had obviously run off the rails, a man one could be sorry for, but could not help? Should one advise him to come home, to transplant himself and take up his old friendships again? There was nothing to hinder him, and in general to rely on the help of his friends. But that was as good as telling him, and the more kindly the more offensively, that all his efforts hitherto had miscarried, that he should finally give up, come back home, and be gaped at by everyone as a returned prodigal, that only his friends knew what was what, and that he himself was just a big child who should do what his successful and homekeeping friends prescribed. And was it certain, besides, that all the pain one would have to inflict on him would achieve its object? Perhaps it would not even be possible to get him to come home at all. He said himself that he was now out of touch with commerce in his native country, and then he would still be left an alien in a foreign land, embittered by his friends' advice and more than ever estranged from them. But if he did follow their advice and then didn't fit in at home, not out of malice, of course, but through force of circumstances, couldn't get on with his friends or without them, felt humiliated, couldn't be said to have either friends or a country of his own any longer. Wouldn't it have been better for him to stay abroad just as he was? Taking all this into account, how could one be sure that he would make a success of life at home? For such reasons, supposing one wanted to keep up correspondence with him, one could not send him any real news such as could frankly be told to the most distant acquaintance. It was more than 3 years since his last visit, and for this he offered the lame excuse that the political situation in Russia was too uncertain, which apparently would not permit even the briefest absence of a small businessman while it allowed hundreds of thousands of Russians to travel peacefully abroad. But during these 3 years, Georg's own position in life had changed a lot. 2 years ago, his mother had died, since when he and his father had shared the household together, and his friend had of course been informed of that, and had expressed his sympathy in a letter phrased so dryly that the grief caused by such an event, one had to conclude, could not be realized in a distant country. Since that time, however, Georg had applied himself with greater determination to the business as well as to everything else. Perhaps during his mother's lifetime, his father's insistence on having everything his own way in the business had hindered him from developing any real activity of his own. Perhaps since her death his father had become less aggressive, although he was still active in the business. Perhaps it was mostly due to an accidental run of good fortune, which was very probable indeed. But at any rate, during those 2 years the business had developed in a most unexpected way. The staff had had to be doubled. The turnover was 5 times as great, no doubt about it. Further progress lay just ahead. But Georg's friend had no inkling of this improvement. In earlier years, perhaps for the last time in that letter of condolence, he had tried to persuade Georg to emigrate to Russia and had enlarged upon the prospects of success for precisely Georg's branch of trade. The figures quoted were microscopic by comparison with the range of Georg's present operations. Yet he shrank from letting his friend know about his business success, and if he were to do it now retrospectively, that certainly would look peculiar. So Georg confined himself to giving his friend unimportant items of gossip, such as rise at random in the memory when one is idly thinking things over on a quiet Sunday. All he desired was to leave undisturbed the idea of the hometown which his friend must have built up to his own content during the long interval. And so it happened to Georg that 3 times in 3 fairly widely separated letters he had told his friend about the engagement of an unimportant man to an equally unimportant girl, until indeed, quite contrary to his intentions, his friend began to show some interest in this notable event. Yet Georg preferred to write about things like these, rather than to confess that he himself had got engaged a month ago to a Fräulein, Frieda Brandenfeld, a girl from a well-to-do family. He often discussed this friend of his with his fiancée and the peculiar relationship that had developed between them in their correspondence. "So, he won't be coming to our wedding," said she. "And yet I have a right to get to know all your friends." "I don't want to trouble him," answered Georg. "Don't misunderstand me, he would probably come, at least I think so. But he would feel that his hand had been forced and he would be hurt. Perhaps he would envy me, and certainly he'd be discontented, and without being able to do anything about his discontent, he'd have to go away again alone." "Alone? Do you know what that means?" "Yes, but may he not hear about our wedding in some other fashion?" "I can't prevent that, of course, but it's unlikely, considering the way he lives. Since your friends are like that, Georg, you shouldn't ever have got engaged at all." "Well, we're both to blame for that, but I wouldn't have it any other way now." And when, breathing quickly under his kisses, she still brought out, "All the same, I do feel upset," he thought it could not really involve him in trouble were he to send the news to his friend. "That's the kind of man I am, and he'll just have to take me as I am," he said to himself. "I can't cut myself to another pattern that might make a more suitable friend for him." And in fact he did inform his friend, in the long letter he had been writing that Sunday morning about his engagement with these words: "I have saved my best news to the end. I have got engaged to a Fräulein Frieda Brandenfeld, a girl from a well-to-do family, who only came to live here a long time after you went away, so that you're hardly likely to know her. There will be time to tell you more about her later. For today, let me just say that I am very happy, and as between you and me the only difference in Our relationship is that instead of a quite ordinary kind of friend, you will now have in me a happy friend. Besides that, you will acquire in my fiancée, who sends her warm greetings and will soon write you herself, a genuine friend of the opposite sex, which is not without importance to a bachelor. I know that there are many reasons why you can't come to see us, but would not my wedding be precisely the right occasion for giving all obstacles that go by? Still, however that may be, do just as seems good to you, without regarding any interests but your own. With this letter in his hand, Georg had been sitting a long time at the writing table, his face turned toward the window. He had barely acknowledged, with an absent smile, a greeting waved to him from the street by a passing acquaintance. At last he put the letter in his pocket and went out of his room across a small lobby into his father's room, which he had not entered for months. There was in fact no need for him to enter it, since he saw his father daily at business, and they took their midday meal together at an eating house in the evening. It was true, each did as he pleased, yet even then, unless Georg, as mostly happened, went out with friends or, more recently, visited his fiancée, they always as a tea for a while, each with his newspaper, in their common sitting room. It surprised Georg how dark his father's room was even on this sunny morning. So it was overshadowed as much as that by the high wall on the other side of the narrow courtyard. His father was sitting by the window in a corner hung with various mementos of Georg's dead mother, reading a newspaper which he held to one side before his eyes in an attempt to overcome a defect of vision. On the table stood the remains of his breakfast, not much of which seemed to have been eaten. "Ah, Georg," said his father, rising at once to meet him. His heavy dressing gown swung open as he walked, and the skirts of it fluttered around him. "My father is still a giant of a man," said Georg to himself. "It's unbearably dark here," he said aloud. "Yes, it's dark enough," answered his father. "And you've shut the window too." "I prefer it like that." "Well, it's quite warm outside," said Georg, as if continuing his previous remark, and set a tea down. His father cleared away the breakfast dishes and set them on a chest. "I really only wanted to tell you," went on Georg, who had been vacantly following the old man's movements, "that I am now sending the news of my engagement to St. Petersburg." He drew the letter a little way from his pocket and let it drop back again. "To St. Petersburg?" asked his father. "To my friend there," said Georg, trying to meet his father's eye. "In business hours he's quite different," he was thinking. "How solidly he sits here with his arms crossed." "Oh, yes? To your friend," said his father with peculiar emphasis. "Well, you know, father, that I wanted not to tell him about my engagement at first. Out of consideration for him, that was the only reason. You know yourself he's a difficult man. I said to myself that someone else might tell him about my engagement, although he's such a solitary creature that was hardly likely. I couldn't prevent that, but I wasn't ever going to tell him myself." "And now you've changed your mind?" asked his father, laying his enormous newspaper on the window-sill and on top of it his spectacles, which he covered with one hand. "Yes, I've been thinking it over. If he's a good friend of mine, I said to myself, my being happily engaged should make him happy too. And so I wouldn't put off telling him any longer. But before I posted the letter, I wanted to let you know." "Georg," said his father, lengthening his toothless mouth, "listen to me. You've come to me about this business, to talk it over with me. No doubt that does you honor. But it's nothing. It's worse than nothing, if you don't tell me the whole truth. I don't want to stir up matters that shouldn't be mentioned here. Since the death of our dear mother, certain things have been done that aren't right. Maybe the time will come for mentioning them, and maybe sooner than we think. There's many a thing in the business I'm not aware of. Maybe it's not done behind my back. I'm not going to say that it's done behind my back. I'm not equal to things any longer. My memory's failing. I haven't an eye for so many things any longer. That's the course of nature in the first place, and in the second place, the death of our dear mother hit me harder than it did you. But since we're talking about it, about this letter, I beg you, Georg, don't deceive me. It's a trivial affair, it's hardly worth mentioning, so don't deceive me." Do you really have this friend in St. Petersburg? Georg rose in embarrassment. Never mind, my friends. 1,000 friends wouldn't make up to me for my father. Do you know what I think? You're not taking enough care of yourself. But old age must be taken care of. I can't do without you in the business, you know that very well, but if the business is going to undermine your health, I'm ready to close it down tomorrow forever. And that won't do. We'll have to make a change in your way of living. But a radical change. You sit here in the dark, and in the sitting room you would have plenty of light. You just take a bite of breakfast instead of properly keeping up your strength. You sit by a closed window, and the air would be so good for you. No, Father. I'll get the doctor to come and we'll follow his orders. We'll change your room. You can move into the front room and I'll move in here. You won't notice the change. All your things will be moved with you. But there's time for all that later. I'll put you to bed now for a little. I'm sure you need to rest. Come, I'll help you to take off your things. You'll see I can do it. Or if you would rather go into the front room at once, you can lie down in my bed for the present. That would be the most sensible thing. Georg stood close beside his father, who had let his head with its unkempt white hair sink on his chest. Georg, said his father in a low voice, without moving. Georg knelt down at once beside his father. In the old man's weary face he saw the pupils, overlarge, fixedly looking at him from the corners of the eyes. You have no friend in St. Petersburg. You've always been a leg puller and you haven't even shrunk from pulling my leg. How could you have a friend out there? I can't believe it. Just think back a bit, Father, said Georg, lifting his father from the chair and slipping off his dressing gown as he stood feebly enough. It'll soon be 3 years since my friend came to see us last. I remember that you used not to like him very much. At least twice I kept you from seeing him, although he was actually sitting with me in my room. I could quite well understand your dislike of him. My friend has his peculiarities. But then, later, you got on with him very well. I was proud because you listened to him, and nodded and asked him questions. If you think back, you're bound to remember. He used to tell us the most incredible stories of the Russian Revolution. For instance, when he was on a business trip to Kiev and ran into a riot, and saw a priest on a balcony who cut a broad cross in blood on the palm of his hand and held the hand up and appealed to the mob. You've told that story yourself once or twice since. Meanwhile, Georg had succeeded in lowering his father down again and carefully taking off the woolen drawers he wore over his linen underpants and his socks. The not particularly clean appearance of his underwear made him reproach himself for having been neglectful. It should have certainly been his duty to see that his father had clean changes of underwear. He had not yet explicitly discussed with his bride-to-be what arrangements should be made for his father in the future, for they had both of them silently taken it for granted that the old man would go on living alone in the old house. But now he made a quick, firm decision to take him into his own future establishment. It almost looked, on closer inspection, as if the care he meant to lavish there on his father might come too late. He carried his father to bed in his arms. It gave him a dreadful feeling to notice that while he took the few steps toward the bed, the old man on his breast was playing with his watch chain. He could not lay him down on the bed for a moment, so firmly did he hang onto the watch chain. But as soon as he was laid in bed, all seemed well. He covered himself up and even drew the blankets farther than usual over his shoulders. He looked up at Georg with a not unfriendly eye. You begin to remember my friend, don't you? Asked Georg, giving him an encouraging nod. Am I well covered up now? Asked his father, as if he were not able to see whether his feet were properly tucked in or not. So you find it snug in bed already, said Georg, and tucked the blankets more closely around him. Am I well covered up? Asked the father once more, seeming to be strangely intent upon the answer. Don't worry, you're well covered up. No, cried his father, cutting short the answer, threw the blankets off with a strength that sent them all flying in a moment, and sprang erect in bed. Only one hand lightly touched the ceiling to steady him. You wanted to cover me up, I know, my young sprig, but I'm far from being covered up yet. And even if this is the last strength I have, it's enough for you too, much for you. Of course I know your friend. He would have been a son after my own heart. That's why you've been playing him false all these years. Why else? Do you think I haven't been sorry for him? And that's why you had to lock yourself up in your office. The chief is busy, mustn't be disturbed, just so that you could write your lying little letters to Russia. But thank goodness a father doesn't need to be taught how to see through his son. And now that you thought you'd got him down, so far down that you could set your bottom on him and sit on him and he wouldn't move, then my fine son makes up his mind to get married. Georg stared at the bogey conjured up by his father. His friend in Stust, Petersburg, whom his father suddenly knew too well, touched his imagination as never before. Lost in the vastness of Russia, he saw him. At the door of an empty, plundered warehouse, he saw him. Among the wreckage of his showcases, the slashed remnants of his wares, the falling gas brackets, he was just standing up. Why did he have to go so far away? But attend to me, cried his father. And Georg, almost distracted, ran toward the bed to take everything in, yet came to a stop halfway. Because she lifted up her skirts, his father began to flute. Because she lifted her skirts like this, the nasty creature, and mimicking her, he lifted his shirt so high that one could see the scar on his thigh from his war wound. Because she lifted her skirts like this, and this you made up to her, and in order to make free with her. Undisturbed, you have disgraced your mother's memory, betrayed your friend, and stuck your father into bed so that he can't move. But he can move, or can't he? And he stood up quite unsupported and kicked his legs out. His insight made him radiant. Georg shrank into a corner, as far away from his father as possible. A long time ago he had firmly made up his mind to watch closely every least movement, so that he should not be surprised by any indirect attack, a pounce from behind or above. At this moment he recalled this long-forgotten resolve, and forgot it again, like a man drawing a short thread through the eye of a needle. But your friend hasn't been betrayed after all, cried his father, emphasizing the point with stabs of his forefinger. I've been representing him here on the spot. You comedian! Georg could not resist the retort, realized at once the harm done, and his eyes starting in his head, bit his tongue back, only too late, till the pain made his knees give. Yes, of course, I've been playing a comedy. A comedy? That's a good expression. What other comfort was left to a poor old widower? Tell me, and while you're answering me, be you still my living son? What else was left to me in my back room, plagued by a disloyal staff, old to the marrow of my bones, and my son, strutting through the world, finishing off deals that I had prepared for him, bursting with triumphant glee, and stalking away from his father with the closed face of a respectable businessman? Do you think I didn't love you, I, from whom you are sprung? Now he'll lean forward, thought Georg. What if he topples and smashes himself? These words went hissing through his mind. His father leaned forward but did not topple. Since Georg did not come any nearer as he had expected, he straightened himself again. Stay where you are, I don't need you. You think you have strength enough to come over here, and that you're only hanging back of your own accord. Don't be too sure. I am still much the stronger of us two. All by myself I might have had to give way, but your mother has given me so much of her strength that I've established a fine connection with your friend, and I have your customers here in my pocket. He has pockets even in his shirt, said Georg to himself, and believed that with this remark he could make him an impossible figure for all the world. Only for a moment did he think so, since he kept on forgetting everything. Just take your bride on your arm and try getting in my way. I'll sweep her from your very side, you don't know how. Georg made a grimace of disbelief. His father only nodded, confirming the truth of his words, toward Georg's corner. How you amused me today, coming to ask me if you should tell your friend about your engagement. He knows it already, you stupid boy. He knows it all. I've been writing to him, for you forgot to take my writing things away from me. That's why he hasn't been here for years. He knows everything 100 times better than you do yourself. In his left hand, he crumples your letters unopened, while in his right hand, he holds up my letters to read through. In his enthusiasm, he waved his arm over his head. He knows everything 1,000 times better, he cried. 10,000 times, said Georg, to make fun of his father. But in his very mouth the words turned into deadly earnest. For years I've been waiting for you to come with some such question. Do you think I concern myself with anything else? Do you think I read my newspapers? Look, and he threw Georg a newspaper sheet which he had somehow taken to bed with him. An old newspaper with a name entirely unknown to Georg. How long a time you've taken to grow up. Your mother had to die, she couldn't see the happy day. Your friend is going to pieces in Russia. Even 3 years ago he was yellow enough to be thrown away. And as for me, you see what condition I'm in. You have eyes in your head for that. So you've been lying in wait for me, cried Georg. His father said pityingly, in an offhand manner, I suppose you wanted to say that sooner. But now it doesn't matter. And in a louder voice, so now you know what else there was in the world besides yourself. Till now you've known only about yourself. An innocent child, yes, that you were. Truly, but still more truly, have you been a devilish human being. And therefore take note. I sentence you now to death by drowning. Georg felt himself urged from the room. The crash with which his father fell on the bed behind him was still in his ears as he fled. On the staircase which he rushed down as if its steps were an inclined plane, he ran into his charwoman on her way up to do the morning cleaning of the room. Jesus, she cried, and covered her face with her apron, but he was already gone. Out of the front door he rushed, across the roadway, driven toward the water. Already he was grasping at the railings as a starving man clutches food. He swung himself over, like the distinguished gymnast he had once been in his youth, to his parents' pride. With weakening grip he was still holding on. When he spied between the railings a motor bus coming which would easily cover the noise of his fall, called in a low voice, Dear parents, I have always loved you, all the same, and let himself drop. At this moment an unending stream of traffic was just going over the bridge.